Pest control. This is another thing that not a lot of people think about, but is a big thing with regard to your apartments or your single-family house. How do you handle pest control? Some people don't, like I said, don't even think about this until there's an issue. But if you've got to pay for a pest control to come out monthly or every 2 months, that cost can add up. It's pretty expensive. The best way to save on cost there is prevention. So prevention is going to go everywhere from educating your tenants, sending them a notice or an email about good practices, keeping kitchens and general household items clean, even so much as where the trash goes. Now, you may not have to or think you have to worry about that, but like in Chicago, for instance, in large major cities, there could be a rat problem with trash if it's not properly contained and things like that. So I think you want to educate your tenants on the best practices to use, cleanliness. If they see an issue, make sure to call. One of the other issues, especially if you have multiple units, is when an issue happens in one unit, you could be assured that it's going to happen in the other ones, even if the other ones are clean. Okay, so you want to make sure that you stop that before there's an issue. I would also with pest control have language in your lease that talks about the idea if there's an issue with your unit and it's a continued issue and we can prove that it's your fault or it started in your unit due to uncleanliness, we can bill you for that. Or maybe even grounds for eviction, okay? Maybe even grounds for eviction. So I would definitely have language in there. You want to make sure that you've got language about a procedure for repairs, emergency and non-emergency. Procedure for repairs. How do your tenants call in if there's a problem with the furnace, if there's a problem with the faucet, if there's other types of problems? I think it's important for you to distinguish between emergency and what is considered non-emergency. A leaky faucet, non-emergency. A water pipe burst, emergency. Okay? So just keep that into consideration and make sure that you're communicating that to your tenants. Circumstances under which the property manager can enter the property and with what notice to the tenant. Again, this is going to vary by state because they're all going to have state laws, 48 hours, 24 hours, that type of thing. Typically, every state is going to allow you to enter a unit if you think there's going to be, or if you think there's an emergency that needs to happen. And you will utilize that, by the way. I had a tenant call me one time and said that she was not able to get a hold of her father, who was a little bit older. He was, I want to say, around 78 years of age. And she was concerned because he was not responding to her phone calls for days. And I said, hey, no problem. I'll go over and check it out. And I hung up the phone. I drove over to the unit. And I didn't really think about how big of a deal this was going to be. Okay? And I hung up the phone, drove over to the unit. I knocked on the door, nothing. Knocked on the door, nothing. And for anonymity, I'm going to use, as his name was Mr. Johnson. So I knocked on the door, Mr. Johnson, nothing. Knocked on the door, Mr. Johnson, you there? Nothing. I took my key, I opened the door. Now, at that point, I'm thinking to myself, what if this person is in the apartment but, you know, dead, unfortunately, knock on wood, but dead. I'm thinking, how am I going to deal with this? You know, at first I'm like, well, I need to, I guess, first verify if he or she is dead, and then, well, do I really have the training to do that? Or I'll probably know right away, is there a smell? All of this stuff is going through my mind. I open the door, go in the living room, and nobody's there. I noticed that the 2-bedroom doors are closed. And I opened the bedroom. Boy, look at you guys listening attentively. I opened the bedroom door, and Mr. Johnson is laying on the bed. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I go up to the bed. I'm like, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson. And he wakes up. He's like, because I scared him. And he wakes up. He's like, oh my goodness. And he scared the crap out of me. And I jumped back about 2 feet, you know. And I was like, oh, thank God, or thank goodness you're alive, you know, and all this stuff. And he's like, what are you talking about, you know? And I'm basically a stranger in his bedroom now and all of this. He did not call his daughter back because he was mad at her, okay? So here I am in someone's apartment unit thinking that there was an emergency, and I really thought there was an emergency when I saw him on the bed. But he was fine, he didn't call her back, but you will have to enter a unit if there's an emergency, okay? Or you think there's an emergency. You can get in at any time, and that's in all 50 states. But if you're doing routine maintenance, if you're checking condition or doing a safety check, that type of thing, typically you want to give the tenant some notice. And the state is probably going to verify some rules on that, 24 hours, 48 hours, things like that. But you will be put into situations like that where you'll have to enter a unit, okay? Questions with that? We good? Can we have you go to the mic, Sam?
John, do you know if there are any states have rules regarding the standard lease? For example, as far as I know, in Ontario, the landlord cannot draft their own lease. There is a standard lease that's issued or drafted by the province or the city to use. How is it here?
In all 50 states, to my knowledge, you can draft your own lease. However, if your property is being managed by an agent, they also have the option of using the state lease that most states have. So they do have that option. That lease is put together by the Board of Realtors. So they do have that capability as well. But primarily, it's owners or property management companies are using a lease that they've created. Okay? Okay. Let's talk about a scenario where we've just closed on a property and now you're the property manager. So let's act as if we are taking over a property. Okay? That's how I want to kind of set up this scenario. And the thing that I think most people don't realize is the fact that property management starts when you're doing due diligence on the property. So when you're going through the tenant files, when you're going through the financials, when you're going through the property itself physically, you are denoting things that you're going to be implementing during property management. For instance, tenant files. When you go through the tenant file, you're going to see things like the rental application. You're going to see things like the lease. You're going to see things like support information, their credit report perhaps, criminal report, past rental history, things like that. One of the things that I look at during the due diligence phase is when I'm looking at the leases. Let's say that we go back to our 12-unit apartment building. And I note that let's put 8 out of the 12 leases are set to expire in the next 60 days. One of the things that I'll note is that as a property manager, I'd want to get in that as the property management, and I take that over, I'd want to get in those tenant files and send letters or call or knock on the door of those tenants and say, are you staying or are you going? You want to make sure that you have ample time to get them a lease addendum or a lease extension, or if they're leaving, you would like to get into that unit as a property manager and see the condition of that unit and what you would have to do to get that unit released. Every month that goes by that you don't have your units leased up It's kind of like an airplane that takes off and a seat hasn't been sold. You've lost the chance to earn that money forever. So the less months that go by that you have less vacancies, the better. Okay? So you want to make sure that you put that into play. Service contracts. The moment you start the due diligence process, what you're going to notice is service contracts for the lawn, snow plowing, other things. What I would do is start almost a bidding process there to make sure that you have the most competitive price. The most competitive price. I had a property that I bought in a town called Lafayette, Indiana. And anybody know Lafayette? Do you know Lafayette? No? You do know Lafayette? The name, okay. Well, in Lafayette, Indiana, it's where Purdue University is. I don't know if anybody's heard of Purdue. Big school. But I bought a property there, and the price that the previous owner was paying for the garbage removal there was about $600 more than what I was able to find. So, you know, I called 3 or 4 companies. I got a company that was $600 less, same service, same scenario, but by calling and finding a contractor that was $600 less prior to closing on the property, if you go through the math, 600 times 12, $7,200, divided by the local cap rate, I was able to increase the value of that building prior to even owning it for a long time by just going through that due diligence phase there. I'm also looking for things like a seller verified rent roll. That's the information that's going to give me when those tenants' leases are expiring. I'm not only going to use that in looking for ways to verify if the tenants are staying or going, but I'm also utilizing that information for things like creative financing. If I go back and say to the seller that 8 of those 12 leases are expiring in the next 2 months, I'm going to implement that in my creative financing. For instance, I would say something like this: Mr. Seller, I've identified that 66% of your leases are expiring within the next 2 months. I would like you to share in that liability with me by giving me seller financing for X amount of days or X amount of months, that type of thing. I'm utilizing what I'm finding in my due diligence to help me creatively with the financing or purchase part of it, but I'm also utilizing that information in my property management. Make sure that when you are doing your due diligence that you are asking for all government licenses and or permits. People ask me what that is. Well, if you've got a property that's got Section 8 tenants, you're definitely going to have to get some language specific to those contracts there, who they're dealing with, what housing authority they're dealing with. Other municipalities are going to have special permits, rental permits perhaps that you'll need. You're going to have to check on that municipality to see what's needed there. You'll have to ask those to be transferred to you, or you're going to have to do that work. I would also at this time ask for any warranties on any personal property on the premises, such as appliances, washers and dryers type thing, furnaces, air conditioning units. Do they have the warranties from when those items were purchased? Do they have the receipts? Make sure that you're keeping track of those and putting those in a file. Most of those warranties do transfer with ownership. Okay? Marco, question.
Yeah. Are those documents you're requesting to the seller agent or to the seller binding, like the rent roll? What will stop a seller to fabricate a rent roll?
Yeah, so his question is what would cause or what would stop a seller from fabricating a rent roll? Well, I think if they're going to fabricate a rent roll, you're kind of going to see the cracks in the foundation in other areas of the property, number one. Number two, There's ways that you can verify that the rent roll you're given is accurate by, number one, asking for something called the Schedule E from their tax returns. That will show you for that property what the income and or loss was for that particular property. You're going to match that income up with the income that should be generated off of the rent roll. And if there's a major discrepancy there, that would be one indication of that. You could also ask for bank statements. If they're not depositing $20,000 worth of checks monthly into their account over the last year, you could kind of call BS to their certified rent roll because maybe they're not bringing in the rent they're saying there. So that would be a second source. Another source would be something called estoppel letters. Estoppel letters are something that you're going to actually send to the tenants, and the tenants are going to verify that, yes, I'm under lease, I pay this much in rent, and this is when my lease is due, or lease is up, that type of thing. Those letters come back signed by the tenants. That's a third way to verify. So there's ways that you can kind of verify if the rent roll is kind of made up. That's what I would be looking for, those items. Okay? Good question. I always would ask for the previous owner's insurance policy. Number one, I want to know what type of coverage they had. Number two, it may be easier for you to get insurance through that agent if you've got no other agent, assuming you've checked them out and they're good and competitive in price and all of that stuff. It may be easier. They've got all the property facts. You might be able to save some money as well. So I always try to ask for the previous insurance agent's policy. I'll know how much they're paying. They know everything there is to know about the property, whether there was any previous claims, which they could search anyway, but they would know firsthand. Leases. Now, sometimes you're going to take over a property, be it a single-family house or a multi-family unit property, that has no leases. Let me kind of explain what that means. Number one, I feel like when you take over a property and there's tenants in there, but the tenants have no leases in place, I think that's actually a little bit higher of liability for you. The reason why that is, the tenants really don't have anything to go off of with respect to rules for that particular complex. So that's the first thing. Number two, because there's no rules, I think that opens the door for you to earn less on those apartment units. Things like when they pay their rent, not playing music loud, all of those things. When there's no rules, that probably affects your tenants, the quality of tenants, the quantity of tenants, so on and so forth. I believe it eliminates the opportunity for communication when you don't have a lease. For instance, I think it's important to communicate to that tenant 45 days prior to lease expiration so that you know and can plan on whether they're staying or going. When there's no leases involved, you don't know from month to month if they're going to plan on leaving or not, so you can't kind of put the machine in motion to get that thing released. So you're going to be caught surprised when that tenant says, I've decided to move somewhere else. So I think that would possibly hurt you. Now, there is a chance, some of the benefits of that, there is a chance that because there's no leases, that I think that you don't have the opportunity to charge for things like pet fees, late fees, and other items. So I think a lease in place gives you the opportunity to do that. I certainly think it is harder for you to get rid of bad seeds. Let me explain what I mean. With like in the city of Chicago, with a tenant with no lease, you've got to give that tenant 60 days notice if you want them to vacate. 60 days notice. A tenant with a lease, if you're evicting them, a tenant with a lease goes through the normal procedure and it's 30 days or less. But without a lease, you've got to give them 60-day notice. So again, I think it's harder to remove the bad seeds. So keep that in mind. The last one here, there is a possibility that because that property has no leases, again, you could use that as an opportunity when buying the property as a way that you can get creative financing. Mr. Seller, I've noticed that your property has no leases. That's a pretty big liability. For me, I would like you to share in that by giving me seller financing for a year or 2 years, that type of thing. Does everybody see that? So again, a lot of these are hindrances, but I think you can turn that negative into a positive by asking for seller financing there. You would be surprised how many properties, property owners, and property managers run their property with no leases. Now, sometimes it might be appropriate to go month to month, but I still think you need to have a lease in place. And that lease would state as its term, this is a month-to-month agreement. It renews every single month. Again, even though you have a month-to-month situation there, I think it's important to have a lease in place because it establishes rules for the tenants to follow. Questions with that? Yep, Sam, microphone.
Actually, a couple of questions.
Okay.
One is there a way of checking the criminal record of the property?
The criminal record of the property.
What happened? Yeah, how many thefts, robberies,
Yeah, yeah. You can typically go to your local county and ask them to do a criminal search specifically on tenants that are coming in. Now, for a property that you're looking at buying, you can't really, unless you have an agreement to do so and permission by the tenants to do so, to do a criminal check on the current tenants. But what I would always recommend is go into the local police station there. Ask them what kind of activity is present in that area. I think it's important to do. I was on in a property last, let's see, about 2 weeks ago in Indianapolis, and as I was there looking at it, the local sheriff was there serving people to go to court for eviction, for criminal offenses, for you name it. And I stopped the guy as he was serving and said, hey, you mind if I ask you a question? How many servings you doing today? And he said, I've got 6 today. And I said, well, how often are you out here? He goes, I'm out here every Saturday. And every Saturday, if he's delivering 6, and it sounded like that was about the average. This was a 109 unit complex. And I'm thinking, that is an awful lot of servings to be doing out here. So that kind of led me to believe that there was not only some criminal activity there, but there was probably tenants there that weren't paying their rent and they were being served eviction. So that seemed rather high to me. I would recommend when you're going out on a 3-day, I'd recommend when you're going out and examining the properties to stop at the local police center or just talk to a police officer and find out what type of activity there. When I go on the 3 days, I'll never forget, I was with Chris. Do you know Chris Urquhart? Do you know him at all? Anybody here? We were on a 3-day in just outside of Fort Lauderdale, and we were in a pretty rough area. And I told Chris that that's what he should do. And I remember pulling up. This police officer was backed in a side street, and he was obviously there monitoring situations because it was a pretty rough area. People, they were having activity happening in the streets that shouldn't be going on. Let's just put it that way. And Chris is like really just a really good guy. He's got that Ottawa accent going on, right? And he goes to the police officer and said, "Excuse me, could you tell me is there a lot of crime in this area? Or what kind of neighborhood this is?" And the cop looks at him, he's like, he used an expletive, which I won't say here, but he's like, "What kind of blank neighborhood do you think this is? Look around you, kind of thing." So sometimes it's going to be more noticeable than other times, but I always think it's a good idea to check with your local law enforcement. make a call. Sometimes they won't give you that information over the phone. You've got to fill out a form. It's called the Freedom of Information Act. You can get that information because it's public, but they can't give it to you without filling out that form. So that's how you would check on that stuff.
Another question?
Yeah.
Last night, when we were doing the search for the...
I need you to talk in the mic. There you go.
Last night, when we were doing the search for the presentation, I tried to search for the government, both federal and state programs for subsidies and whatever kind of support programs for all kinds of things, students or for rehabbing old properties or something. But the
Grants.
Yeah, the information I could come up with were all scattered and really, basically the question is there a depot of some sort where we can find the government subsidy programs, grants, etc.?
Yeah. What I would do is check with the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority. Go to HUD.gov. Would be also a resource for you. But the FHA is going to monitor and provide grant programs for all kinds of situations like that. Student housing, low income, elderly. That's what you're looking for, right? That would be where I would go for that. You would see a lot of opportunity to find stuff like that. Now, those programs are very management intensive. The grant writing process is very intensive, but the money every year is set aside by the federal government, and unfortunately it's not used as much as it should be. So there is opportunities. Now, how you guys fit within that, being Canadian citizens, you may need to look at getting a sponsor or work that out a different way, but it's definitely worth looking at, I would say. Absolutely. Good questions.